welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in the Mighty Dozen, James reconciled with the team with help from Eddie, Peter, and Clara, but now Henderson is moving in for the kill, and it's up to James in his monster form to stop him. But will he? We're about to find out. Ready? All right. Let's begin. Chapter 14. Henderson's defeat. Okay, so he does defeat him. But how? Henderson's defeat. Henderson was looking over the top of the machine tank he was in and could clearly see the giant orange monster that was James, but he could barely make out the rest of the team. Either way, he wasn't about to let anybody stand in his way. There they are, men! Take them down, he ordered, pointing at them. One of the sergeants, who was looking through a pair of binoculars, saw who was in James's company. He looked like he was having second thoughts. But sir, there are children amongst them. I don't care! Kill them! Kill them all! Outraged, the sergeant threw his binoculars down and glared at Henderson. No, Henderson, he turned to the soldiers. Men, stand down! Deeply angered by this betrayal, Henderson pulled out his machete and stabbed the sergeant to death. As he fell to the ground, Henderson turned to the soldiers. Keep going! Prepare to fire! By now, Henderson had gone so mad with rage that no one dared to argue him back, especially considering he had now just killed two of his men. The soldiers took aim. Look out! James roared in horror. Smash! The blast struck the ground. Fortunately, no one was killed, but the impact knocked everybody off their feet. Eddie, Peter, and Clara felt the impact so badly that when they hit the ground, they were knocked unconscious. No! James looked like he was about to cry as the rest of the team gathered around the three kids. Eddie, Peter, Clara, please forgive me. James growled angrily in the direction of the machine tanks as his eyes blazed red again. He turned to the team. Protect the three of them from harm. I'll take care of General Henderson. With that, James stormed towards Henderson, looking triumphant. The team, no longer afraid of James and his monster form, cheered for him enthusiastically. Meanwhile, several machine tanks came to a stop as they saw James coming towards them, and they screamed in terror. Furious, James turned around, and before he could ask them, they pointed at what was in front of them. Henderson turned around, and his cold blue eyes widened in horror when he saw James coming right up to them. And in case you're wondering why he didn't see James before, it was because he was too busy making sure the soldiers in his machine tank were loading the cannons with ammo and explosives. Don't just stand there! Bring him down, men! Attack! He shrieked hysterically. Several machine tanks fired, and while most of the blasts missed James, the ones that did only sideswiped him and had no effect on him whatsoever. Again. Without a second thought, James started smashing the tanks as best as he could, scaring the soldiers away. At one point, Sergeants Parker and Thompson, along with 20 other soldiers, tried to physically attack James by jumping on his gigantic, bulky body. Roaring in anger, James threw them off. It was lucky for the soldiers that they were not far off the ground, or they would have received more than minor injuries. Parker and Thompson managed to hold on to James, but James threw them off, causing them to go flying and slam against one of the tanks, knocking them out cold. This was too much for the other soldiers, who retreated in terror, screaming like bloody cowards. Henderson was appalled. Hey! Where the hell do you think you're going? Come back here and fight him like men, you bloody cowards! Suck it, Henderson! Henderson turned around and saw James standing nearby, laughing uproariously. That's better. As he did a victory dance with his hands in the air. From afar, the others, seeing James's victory dance, began cheering triumphantly and started shouting words of praise to James, even though he couldn't hear them. However, as James celebrated his victory with his back turned to Henderson, the general, livid with rage at his defeat, started looking in the tank for any leftover ammo. He found a particularly large blaster, which not only was more deadly looking than the other ammo, but it hardly fit in the tank's cannon. Henderson loaded the cannon himself and aimed it directly at James. At that moment, Carly noticed something was wrong. Although she didn't have supervision, she could tell Henderson was up to no good. She pointed this out to Richard and Christy, and the three of them looked horrified. "James, look out!" they shouted as loud as they could in unison. James, happening to hear that, turned around, and as he did so, boom! Henderson fired at James, intending to hit him directly in the heart. James tried to get out of the way, but he wasn't quick enough. The ammo swiped him across his chest, leaving several deep, bloody lines streaked across. He roared with pain and staggered. "No! No! James! James!" Christie's, Richard's, and Carly's yells echoed across the desert as James fell to the ground. He crashed with such an impact that the Mighty Nine was knocked off their feet again. On the other hand, Eddie, Peter, and Clara were conscious again, and fortunately unharmed. Henderson, seeing James fall, grinned evilly at his face was full of savage triumph, and laughed sadistically. Then he saw the Mighty Nine running towards James. He looked at the scene questioningly. Everybody gathered around James as he lay down on the ground, all at a loss for words. James was breathing heavily, blood marks across his chest, his eyes flickering feebly. He tried to speak but was unable to do so. Looking at his team, James tried to speak again, but instead he laid his head and hands down and closed his eyes. Everyone was shocked, but before anyone could say anything, there was another flash of blinding light as James slowly and miraculously turned back into his human form. Everyone, especially Carly, was shocked and amazed by it all. Once James was in his human form again, the blinding light disappeared. He still had orange skin and green hair, but at least now he wasn't a 50-foot monster. But everyone else, thinking James was dead, started to cry. Carly was so upset it looked as if the light had gone out of her life. "I don't believe it," she said tearfully. "He gave his life for us." "You think the blast from the general had something to do with James turning back into a human?" asked Reginald. Well, that's a comforting thought, sobbed Frank. "The monster's gone, but I'm afraid the same thing has happened to our beloved James." "Hug me, brother," cried Gary. As Frank and Gary hugged each other, James suddenly coughed. He wasn't dead after all. He was still alive, just merely knocked unconscious, and badly wounded. "Oh, thank goodness," Christy sighed with relief. "But he's bleeding," Richard cried, pointing. Peter and Clara came over with a long roll of linen cloth. "We had a feeling something like this was going to happen," said Clara. "Good thing we always come prepared, right, Clara?" Peter said. "Exactly, Peter." Frank and Christy lifted James's upper body, and, using his super speed, Richard ran around James's body, wrapping the linen tightly around him to stop the bleeding. Using her powers, Christy then created ice, which she used to cover James's chest to soothe the pain. "That should hold him until we get him to the hospital," said Richard. "And the ice should stop the swelling," added Christy. "I guess medical school is starting to pay off for us." "You got that right, Christy." Then Richard remembered something. "Be right back." He suddenly zipped out of sight, leaving the others confused, only for him to return around 15 seconds later. "I just informed the authorities and the mayor," he panted. "They're on their way with an ambulance." Everybody was relieved, and Christy put her hands on Richard's shoulders affectionately. Just then, Eddie heard footsteps and turned around. only to find himself face to face with General Henderson, who had a rifle in his hands. He didn't look like himself anymore. His uniform was dusty, his hair was disheveled and standing on end, and his cold blue eyes were flaming red. In truth, he looked like a mad scientist minus the lab coat and gloves. The others gasped when they saw Henderson too. "All right, you monsters. Get out of the way!" Nobody dared to move, but Henderson made his way through, aggressively shoving everybody out of the way or to the ground. James was stirring, but upon seeing Henderson, his eyes, which were brown again, widened in fear. Henderson laughed sinisterly. "Prepare to die, James Reitherman," he said in an undertone. He clicked the rifle. James winced and shut his eyes tightly as Henderson aimed the rifle directly at his head. But just as Henderson was ready to kill, Carly suddenly moved in front of James, protecting him from harm. She stared angrily up at Henderson, who was initially startled, but quickly regained his composure. "Stand aside, vile woman," he said quietly. Carly wouldn't move, and her green eyes became slits of fury. Richard and Christie also stood up on either side of Carly, further protecting James. "I said stand aside! Now!" The three of them just stared angrily at Henderson. One by one, everybody else stood all around James, not taking their eyes off the general. Eddie, Peter, and Clara, however, were frightened by the general and hid behind the Mighty Nine, shielding James's body. Though Henderson realized he was outnumbered, he refused to back down. "Have it your own way," he said angrily. "If you won't move, then you will die as well, starting with your leader." Shoving Carly to the ground with his foot, Henderson clicked the gun and prepared to shoot James. "Get away from him, you fucking bastard!" Carly suddenly lunged at Henderson and jumped on him, causing him to drop his gun. The others were shocked, except a semi-conscious James, as he was watching the woman he loved in awe. Carly wrestled with Henderson tooth and nail, and at first he was unable to fight her back, which was really pathetic for someone like him. However, after about 20 seconds or so, Henderson grabbed a hold of Carly and attempted to keep her in a chokehold. But Carly, thinking fast, sank her teeth into his flesh. Henderson screamed in pain and threw Carly to the ground as hard as he could. The others winced. Henderson picked up Carly with the intent of beating her to death. "You'll pay for that, you little bitch!" Just then, Christie, shouting a battle cry, lunged at